How many people would it take to hide 100 tons of sand in plain sight? What if you had to do it with guards watching your every move? During the Second World War, tens of thousands of Allied service members became prisoners. They were confined behind barbed wire, living in a world of routine, boredom, and constant surveillance. But for many, captivity was not an end. It was a problem to be solved. The Geneva Convention of 1929 laid out the rules for treating prisoners of war. It also recognized an officer's duty to try to escape. Escaping wasn't just about personal freedom. Every escape attempt, successful or not, forced the enemy to divert resources. Guards, dogs, trains, and paperwork were all tied up hunting for escapees. A successful escape was a victory. It was a way to get back in the fight. These are not stories of grand battles. They are stories of human ingenuity. They are about men using whatever they could find, bed slats, milk tins, thread from old sweaters to challenge fortified walls and trained guards. They dug tunnels with soup spoons. They forged documents with homemade ink. They tailored disguises from blankets. They built radios to hear news from home and compasses to guide their way. They did it all under the noses of their captors. These are 21 stories of people who refused to accept their situation. They decided to go home. Number 21, how do you walk out of a castle dressed as the enemy? Colditz Castle, the name itself was a warning. It was a fortress perched on a cliff in eastern Germany, designated Auflag 4C. This was a Sonderlager, a special camp for prisoners who were considered high risk. They were the ones who had already tried to escape from other camps. The German authorities thought that putting all the most troublesome prisoners in one escape-proof location would solve the problem. They were wrong. It just created a university of escapology. One of the earliest and boldest escapes from Colditz was pulled off by British officer Airey Neave. Neave had already tried to escape once, disguised as a German non-commissioned officer. He was caught. His second attempt, in January 1942, was even more ambitious. The plan was to impersonate a German officer. This required more than just a costume. It required a flawless performance. Neave and a Dutch officer, Anthony Lutain, worked for months. They acquired pieces of a German uniform. A Polish officer tailored a German army greatcoat for Neave from a Polish uniform. Another prisoner crafted a cap from cardboard and painted fabric. The details had to be perfect. The insignia were drawn with colored pencils. The forgery department in the castle, a hidden workshop of artists and draftsmen, created impeccable identity papers. The escape route was through the prisoners' theater. Below the stage was a trapdoor leading to a guardhouse and a passage out of the castle. On the night of January 5th, 1942, during a theatrical performance, Neave and Lutain slipped through the trapdoor. They changed into their disguises. They waited for the right moment when the sentries were changing shifts. And then they simply walked out. Neave, with his fluent German, confidently greeted the guards. They walked past the sentries, through the main courtyard, and out the front gate. The sheer audacity of it worked. They looked the part, so no one questioned them. Once outside, they traveled by train, using their forged papers and a carefully rehearsed story. They made their way across Germany and into Switzerland, reaching the British consulate in Bern. Airey Neave became the first British officer to make a home run from Colditz. His escape was a major morale boost for the other prisoners. It proved the escape-proof castle was anything but. The stories detailed in Neave's own book, they have their exits. How many near misses did the forgery department have before they perfected the documents? Were there specific guards who were known to be less observant, and was the escape time to coincide with their shifts? And what was the exact recipe for the ink they used to make papers that could pass under direct inspection? Of number 20, can a wooden horse defeat barbed wire? Stalag III was the same camp made famous by another larger escape. But before that, there was a simpler, more elegant plan. It was an escape based on a classic misdirection like a magic trick. The idea came from a book one of the prisoners was reading, The Trojan War. The concept was to build a vaulting horse, the kind used in gymnastics. The plan was devised by 3 Royal Air Force officers, Eric Williams, Michael Codner, and Oliver Philpott. They realized the guards in the watchtowers had a blind spot. They couldn't see the ground directly next to the perimeter fence. The prisoners told the camp authorities they wanted to build a vaulting horse to get some exercise and relieve the boredom. The request was approved. Every day, a team of prisoners would carry the large wooden horse out to the same spot near the fence. While a group of men noisily exercised and vaulted over it, one or two men were hidden inside. Once the horse was in position, the man inside would open a trapdoor in the bottom and start digging a short tunnel. The dirt he excavated was put into small bags tied to his trousers. When the exercise period was over, the man would climb back inside the horse. The bags of dirt would be carried away by the other prisoners, hidden in their pockets or pants, and discreetly scattered around the camp gardens. This went on for months, from the summer into the autumn of 1943. Day after day, the horse was carried out. The digging continued, and the horse was carried back in. The guards saw it so often it became part of the daily routine. They never bothered to inspect it. Inside, Williams, Codner, and Philpott took turns digging. They worked in a cramped, dark space, scraping away sand with small trowels. On October 29th, 1943, the tunnel was ready. It was just long enough to get them under the wire. That afternoon, the three men were inside the horse. As their friends vaulted overhead, they broke through to the surface on the other side of the fence in a shallow ditch. They waited until dusk, then crawled out and walked away. Dressed as civilian workers and carrying fake papers, they headed for the local train station. Williams and Codner traveled together while Philpott went alone. All three men managed to reach neutral Sweden by stowing away on ships from Baltic ports. The story was immortalized in Eric Williams' book, The Wooden Horse, and later a film. It was a masterpiece of simplicity and patience. Was there a precise weight limit for the horse? And how did they test it to ensure the men carrying it didn't show signs of strain with the extra weight of a person inside? Did the guards ever get close to discovering the plan, forcing the diggers to stop for a period? And how many other recreational activities in POW camps were actually covers for escape plans that were never completed? Number 19, what if your best escape tool was your own sickness? Not all escapes relied on tunnels or disguises. Some relied on exploiting the enemy's bureaucracy and their fear of disease. This was the case for a group of British officers held in the Gavi POW camp in northern Italy. Gavi was a formidable fortress, and direct escape was nearly impossible. So they came up with a medical deception. The plan was the brainchild of a British medical officer, Captain Ion Ferguson. The idea was to fake a serious contagious illness so convincingly that the Italian authorities would have to transfer them to a civilian hospital. From a hospital, escape would be much easier than from a military fortress. The disease they chose was feigned renal colic, a condition involving severe abdominal pain. It was difficult to disprove without complex medical tests. The escape committee selected a group of officers for the attempt. They were coached by Captain Ferguson on how to fake the symptoms. They learned how to writhe in agony, how to describe the pain, and how to manipulate their own bodies to produce some physical signs. The performance had to be perfect. They would be examined by Italian doctors who were not easily fooled. One by one, the sick officers began their act. They would collapse, screaming in pain. The camp infirmary was soon filled with men supposedly suffering from this ailment. The Italian doctors were suspicious, but couldn't definitively prove they were faking. The prisoners even found ways to introduce blood into their urine samples to make the diagnosis more convincing. The pressure on the camp authorities mounted. The prospect of a major epidemic in a crowded prison was a serious concern. Eventually, the Italians relented. They agreed to move the sickest prisoners to a hospital in Acqui. Among them was Lieutenant Commander J.D. Dave Forrest. Once at the hospital, the prisoners found security was much lighter. In October 1942, Forrest and another officer, Brigadier John Combe, simply walked out of the hospital disguised as Italian civilians. They made their way south, eventually reaching Allied lines. The story of the Gavi medical scheme is a classic example of psychological warfare using the captors' own procedures and fears against them. The full details can be found in the book Take These Men by Cyril J. G. Barrows. What were the long-term health effects, if any, on the men who subjected themselves to these fake symptoms and treatments? How did they manage to consistently smuggle blood into their medical samples without being caught? And were any of the Italian doctors secretly sympathetic, choosing to believe the act to help the prisoners? Number 18, how do you escape from an island? Crete, 1941. After the German invasion of the island, thousands of Allied soldiers were captured. For them, escape was a daunting prospect. They were on an island surrounded by water and patrolled by enemy boats, but for some, the sea was not a barrier, it was the only way out. One of the most remarkable sea escapes was led by a New Zealand officer, Captain James Hargest. Hargest was a high-ranking officer, a brigadier, captured during the fighting in North Africa and later moved to a camp for senior officers near Florence, Italy. He and fellow New Zealander, Brigadier Reginald Miles, were determined to get back into the war. In March 1943, they managed to escape their camp in Italy through a tunnel. Their goal was Switzerland. They traveled for days, but tragically, Miles was separated from Hargest and was later reported to have fallen to his death. Hargest pressed on alone. With the help of the Italian resistance, he made it to the Swiss border and crossed to freedom. But his journey wasn't over. He wanted to get back to Britain. He made his way through occupied France to Spain. From there, he was flown back to England in October 1943. He was one of the highest-ranking Allied officers to escape from enemy captivity and return to duty. But the story of island escapes often involved more basic means. After the fall of Crete, many stranded soldiers and airmen went into hiding in the mountains, aided by the local Cretan population. Small groups would try to signal Allied submarines or commandeer small fishing boats. One such story involved Flight Lieutenant Dudley Perkins and his crew. After their plane was shot down, they evaded capture. They eventually found a dilapidated boat. With virtually no sailing experience, they navigated across 200 miles of open sea, eventually reaching British-held territory in North Africa. Their journey, lasting 10 days, was a testament to pure grit and luck. These escapes are documented in various personal memoirs and in historical records like W. Wynne Mason's Prisoners of War, official history. How many small, unrecorded sea escapes from Crete and other Greek islands were successful? What was the true extent of the local population support network, and how many paid the ultimate price for helping Allied soldiers? And for a man like Perkins, with no sailing experience, what simple navigational tricks did he use to cross such a vast expanse of water? Number 17, could you build a glider in an attic? This is perhaps the most audacious escape plan that was never fully executed, but it deserves its place for sheer ingenuity. At Colditz Castle, the prisoners' ingenuity reached its peak. After years of failed tunnels and risky disguises, two Royal Air Force pilots, Bill Goldfinch and Jack Best, came up with an idea that seemed impossible. They decided to fly out. The plan was to build a two-man glider in a hidden workshop in a remote section of the castle's attic. The castle chapel had a long, sloping roof that they identified as a potential runway. They would launch the glider from the roof, hoping to clear the walls and land in a nearby field. The project began in the winter of 1943. The engineering challenge was immense. They had no access to proper materials. The glider, nicknamed the Colditz Cock, was built from stolen bedboards, floorboards, and cotton sleeping bag covers. The control wires were made from electrical wiring taken from unused parts of the castle. The ribs of the wings were formed by boiling and bending wooden slats. They used stolen millet, a type of grain, and boiled it to create a form of glue to seal the fabric wings. A team of about a dozen prisoners worked in shifts as lookouts and builders. They constructed a false wall in the attic to hide their workshop. The guards who patrolled the castle grounds were a constant threat. The project was kept secret from the general prison population to minimize the risk of discovery. Over a period of more than a year, the glider slowly took shape. By the spring of 1945, it was complete and ready for launch. It had a wingspan of 32 feet and was designed to carry two men. The plan was to launch it when the war was nearing its end, to avoid being shot down by their own side. But in April 1945, the castle was liberated by American forces before the glider could be used. When the American troops arrived, they were shown the secret workshop and the completed glider. They were astonished. The glider itself was a masterpiece of clandestine engineering. The story is told in detail in Pat Reed's book, The Colditz Story. The glider was a symbol of the prisoners' unyielding desire for freedom, even when the odds seemed impossible. A full-scale replica was later built and successfully flown in 2012, proving the design was sound. What were the precise aerodynamic calculations Goldfinch and Best used, and how accurate were they, given their lack of tools? Were there any close calls where a guard almost discovered the false wall in the attic? And if they had launched, what were the actual chances they would have cleared the castle walls and landed safely? Number 16, how do you fool an entire train station? Franz von Vera was a German fighter pilot, a Luftwaffe ace. He was shot down over Britain in September 1940 and became a prisoner of war. Unlike most prisoners who were sent to camps in Germany or occupied Europe, von Vera was sent to a camp in Britain. He was determined to escape. He made several attempts, each one more brazen than the last. His most famous attempt in Britain involved him impersonating a Dutch pilot. It almost worked. But his ultimate escape happened after he was transferred to Canada. In January 1941, he was on a prisoner transport train crossing the country, heading to a camp on the shore of Lake Superior. The train was filled with other captured German airmen. Von Vera knew that the United States was still neutral at this point. If he could cross the border from Canada into the U.S., he might be able to find a way back to Germany. He planned his escape carefully. He had a friend distract the guards at one end of the train car. As the train slowed near Smiths Falls, Ontario, von Vera simply opened a window and jumped out into the deep snow. The other prisoners covered for him, making noise to mask his exit. He landed in the freezing Canadian winter, wearing only his standard prison clothes. He started walking south, following the railway tracks. He eventually came across the St. Lawrence River, which formed the border between Canada and the U.S. The river was frozen, but dangerously so, with patches of open water. He found a small, abandoned boat and used it to push himself across the treacherous ice floes. He finally reached the American side, near Ogdensburg, New York. Once in the U.S., he turned himself in to the police. He claimed he was a refugee. His case became a diplomatic headache. The British wanted him back. The German embassy in Washington got involved. While the authorities were deciding what to do, von Vera, with the help of the German consulate, slipped away again. He made his way to Mexico, then to South America, and eventually back to Germany by April 1941. He was the only German prisoner of war to escape from a camp in Canada and make it all the way back home during the war. His story was documented in the book, The One That Got Away, by Kendall Burt and James Leeser. How did von Vera survive the initial hours in the Canadian winter with inadequate clothing? Did he receive any unplanned help from locals who were unaware of his identity? And what specific diplomatic channels were used by the German consulate to spirit him out of the U.S. before he could be extradited? Number 15, can you just ask to be let out? Sometimes the most effective escape plans were not the most complicated. They were the ones that relied on pure, unadulterated nerve. This was the method used by Lieutenant Charles Foster Kelly from a camp in northern Italy. His plan didn't involve tunnels, gliders, or elaborate disguises. It involved a telephone and a lot of confidence. Foster Kelly was an officer in the Irish Guards. He was captured in North Africa in 1941 and sent to a POW camp. While there, he studied the camp's routine and its administration. He noticed that the Italian camp commandant was often away. He also learned that the camp had a telephone line that could connect to the outside world. He devised a plan with a fellow prisoner. His friend, who spoke fluent Italian with the correct accent, would call the camp's main gate. Posing as a high-ranking official from the Italian War Ministry in Rome, he would give a direct order for the release of Lieutenant Foster Kelly. The story was that Foster Kelly was needed for an urgent interrogation regarding a sensitive intelligence matter. To make the plan work, they needed official-looking paperwork. The camp's forgery department went to work creating a set of release documents that looked completely authentic. They even included the correct stamps, which they made from carved potatoes. The day came, the phone call was made. The official from Rome was very convincing, using the right tone of authority and impatience. He ordered the camp's acting commandant to release Foster Kelly into the custody of two special agents who would be waiting for him outside the gate. The two agents were, of course, other prisoners who had escaped earlier and were waiting in the wings. The acting commandant, flustered by a direct order from Rome, didn't question it. He summoned Foster Kelly, checked the forged paperwork, and personally escorted him to the front gate. Foster Kelly was formally handed over to his escorts, and the three men simply walked away. By the time the real commandant returned and the deception was discovered, Foster Kelly and his friends were long gone. They were aided by the Italian resistance and eventually made it back to Allied territory. This escape, detailed in memoirs from the Italian campaign, showed that sometimes the pen, or in this case, the telephone, is mightier than the sword. What was the name of the prisoner who made the phone call? And how did he perfect his impersonation of a high-ranking official? Were there any specific bureaucratic blunders at the camp that Foster Kelly had observed, which made him believe this audacious plan could work? And what was the fallout for the acting commandant who authorized the release? Number 14, what happens when the doctor is an escape artist? Captain Pat Reed was a British Army officer and one of the most famous inmates of Colditz. He was not a doctor, but he played a crucial role in many escape plans, documenting them later in his famous book, The Colditz Story. But the camp was also home to a real medical officer who became a key figure in the escape world, Captain Dickie Herbert. Herbert's medical knowledge gave him a unique advantage. He understood the camp's infirmary, the routines of the German medical staff, and the procedures for transferring prisoners to outside hospitals. He became the go-to consultant for prisoners planning to feign illness. He could advise them on the most convincing symptoms and how to endure medical examinations without giving the game away. But Herbert was also an active escapee himself. One of the classic escape routes from Colditz was through the camp's sewers. The sewer system was old and complex. A group of British officers, including Herbert, decided to explore it. They discovered a manhole in the floor of the camp canteen. From there, they could access a large storm drain that ran under the castle and emptied out on the hillside beyond the walls. The journey through the sewer was grueling. It was dark, filled with filth, and extremely narrow in places. In October 1942, a group of 4 officers, including Pat Reed himself, made their attempt through this route. They successfully navigated the sewer system and emerged outside the castle walls. Reed and another officer made it all the way to Switzerland. Herbert's own escape came later. He was involved in so many escape attempts and provided so much medical cover for others that he was a marked man. He eventually managed to get out during a transfer. His expertise was not just in medicine, but in understanding the psychology of his captors. He knew how to use their own rules and procedures to create opportunities. His work and that of the other Colditz prominents is a case study in organized resistance. The level of cooperation, from the forgers to the tailors to the lookout stooges, made Colditz a hub of creative defiance. How many escape attempts were directly enabled by Herbert's medical advice, and how many of those were successful? Did he ever have to provide genuine medical care to an escapee who was injured during an attempt? And what specific psychological tactics did he recommend to prisoners to help them withstand interrogation if caught? Number 13, how do you cross a continent in an enemy's uniform? Giles Romilly was not a typical prisoner of war. He was a journalist and the nephew of Winston Churchill's wife. When he was captured in Norway in 1940, the German authorities realized they had a high-value prisoner. He was eventually sent to Colditz Castle. Because of his connections, he was classified as a prominente, a prominent prisoner, who was to be held as a potential bargaining chip. Being a prominente had its downsides. Security around them was even tighter. Escape was considered almost impossible. But that didn't stop them from trying. In the final chaotic weeks of the war, as Allied forces were advancing deep into Germany, the authorities decided to move the prominente from Colditz to a more secure location. In April 1945, Romilly and a group of other prominent prisoners, including a relative of the British king, were being transported south under heavy guard. The situation was fluid. The chain of command was breaking down. This was their chance. During a stop in a small town, Romilly and a Dutch officer managed to slip away from their guards. They were in the heart of Germany with no support network. Their only hope was to reach the advancing American lines. Their strategy was bold. They acquired pieces of German uniforms and posed as foreign workers. Romilly, who spoke some German, did the talking. They bluffed their way through checkpoints, convincing guards they were laborers heading home. They traveled for days, mostly on foot, scavenging for food. They witnessed the collapse of the German war effort firsthand. Finally, they saw a column of American tanks. They had to approach carefully to avoid being mistaken for enemy soldiers. They managed to make contact and were finally safe. Romilly's journey was a race against time, a desperate dash for freedom through a collapsing empire. He later wrote about his experiences in the book Hostages at Colditz. What were the specific details of how Ramilly and his companion acquired their disguises in the middle of a chaotic retreat? How many checkpoints did they have to pass through, and what was their closest call, and did their status as Prominente afford them any unknown advantages or disadvantages during their final weeks of captivity? Number 12, can you turn a joke into a key? The ingenuity of prisoners often came from turning everyday objects into sophisticated tools. At Oflag the 7B in Eichstätt, Germany, a group of British officers perfected the art of making keys. The camp was housed in a former army barracks, and most of the doors had standard but strong locks. The master locksmith was a man known as Flip Webster. He discovered that the keys to many of the doors were made of a soft metal alloy. He developed a method for creating perfect copies. A prisoner would manage to borrow a guard's key for a few minutes. They would press it into a bar of soap or a piece of chewing gum to create a mold. Back in a hidden workshop, they would melt down silver paper from cigarette packs or lead from toothpaste tubes in a spoon over a candle. This molten metal was carefully poured into the mold. Once it cooled, they had a rough key. Then, using small homemade files, they would painstakingly shape the key until it was a perfect copy of the original. This skill became crucial for the camp's escape committee. They could open doors to storage rooms to acquire supplies. Or they could open doors to restricted areas to scout escape routes. They could even open the doors to their own barracks at night, allowing them to move around the camp after lockdown. One of the most famous escapes from Eichstätt involved a mass tunnel. The keymakers were essential. They provided access to the building where the tunnel entrance was located. Without their ability to silently open locked doors, the entire operation would have been impossible. The story of the camp's key factory is a recurring theme in memoirs from officers held there, such as those found in the archives of the Imperial War Museum. It shows how a single, well-honed skill could undermine the security of an entire camp. What was the failure rate for their homemade keys, and what happened when a key broke off inside a lock? How did they manage to get the original keys back to the guards without them noticing they had been gone? And were there any other common materials besides lead and silver paper that they found worked for key making? Number 11, what if the walls were made of sand? Stalag XXA, located near Thorn in occupied Poland, was a massive camp holding thousands of prisoners. The soil in this region was incredibly sandy. This made tunneling both a blessing and a curse. It was easy to dig, but the tunnels were extremely prone to collapse. Despite the danger, tunneling was the most popular escape method. One of the most ambitious projects was a tunnel started in 1942. It was dug from a barracks hut and aimed to go under the main perimeter fence. The man in charge of the operation was Sergeant Major Charles Coward. Coward was a legendary figure known as the Count of Auschwitz for his later work saving Jewish prisoners, a story outside the scope of this discussion, but indicative of his character. The digging was done by teams of men working in short shifts. The sand they excavated was a major problem. They couldn't just dump it in the yard. They devised a system of hiding it in the walls. The barracks were hollow-walled, and they were able to cut small holes and pour the sand into the wall cavities. Over months, they hid tons of sand this way. The tunnel was shored up with bedboards and any other wood they could find. Ventilation was provided by a pipe made of linked milk tins, but the constant risk was collapse. Men were frequently buried in small cave-ins and had to be dug out by their comrades. In the spring of 1943, after nearly a year of work, the tunnel was complete. A large group of prisoners prepared to escape. But just as the first men were about to go, the tunnel was discovered. It was a devastating blow. However, the story of the Thorn Tunnel is not one of failure, but of persistence. Dozens of tunnels were started at this camp. While many were found, some were successful. The constant digging kept the German guards on high alert and tied up significant resources. These efforts are part of the collective history of POW life, often told in unpublished memoirs and private letters held by families. How did they accurately calculate the amount of sand the hollow walls could hold? Were there any early warning systems in the tunnel to detect a potential collapse? And Was the discovery of the main tunnel the result of a betrayal or simply a lucky search by the guards? Number 10. How do you run a secret war from a prison cell? For some prisoners, escape was not just about getting out, it was about continuing the fight from inside the wire. Lieutenant General Sir Philip Neame was one of the most senior British officers captured in the war. He was held in a special camp for generals in Italy called Castello di Vincigliata. Neame and the other generals, including Air Marshal Owen Tudor Boyd, knew that a physical escape for a group of older, high-ranking officers was unlikely to succeed. So they focused their energy on intelligence and communication. They established a sophisticated secret organization within the castle walls. They built a radio receiver hidden inside a hollowed-out log. Every night, they would listen to the BBC news broadcasts from London. This was vital for morale, but it was also a source of intelligence. They kept detailed diaries and maps, tracking the progress of the war. This information was coded and smuggled out of the camp through various channels, including letters that had hidden messages in them. Their greatest achievement was establishing contact with the local Italian resistance. They were able to pass information about German troop movements and defenses that they observed or overheard from their guards. They effectively turned their prison into an intelligence gathering post. In September 1943, when Italy surrendered, the guards at the castle fled. The generals were technically free, but they were in enemy-occupied territory. Neame and his group made contact with the resistance and went into hiding. For months, they were sheltered by Italian families, moving from place to place to avoid capture. They were eventually able to make their way through the German lines to safety. Their story, detailed in Neame's book Playing with Strife, shows that resistance could take many forms, and that the Battle of the Wire was also a battle of wits and information. What were the specific codes they used to smuggle information out, and how were they developed without access to cryptographic materials? How many Italian civilians were involved in their support network, and what was the communication system between them? And did any of the intelligence they gathered directly influence an Allied military operation? Number 9, can a single man outsmart an entire system? Alistair Cram was a Scottish officer in the Royal Artillery. He was captured in North Africa in 1942. For the next 3 years, he became one of the most persistent and successful escape artists of the entire war. He didn't lead a famous mass escape. Instead, he specialized in a series of solo attempts, each one demonstrating incredible resilience. Cram was sent to the Gavi camp in Italy. He made his first escape from there by simply climbing the walls. He was recaptured. He was then sent to another camp. He escaped again. This became a pattern. In total, he made over 20 escape attempts. He was caught and punished multiple times, but he never gave up. His methods were varied. He jumped from moving trains. He walked out of camps disguised as an Italian workman. He cut through fences. He once spent weeks living in the wild in the Italian mountains, surviving off the land. His persistence was legendary. The camp authorities moved him from camp to camp, considering him a major security risk. His final successful escape came in 1945. He was being held in Austria. As the war was ending, he managed to slip away during a transfer. He traveled across Austria and into Allied-occupied Italy. When he finally reported to a British unit, the officer in charge was skeptical. Cram's name had appeared on so many POW lists from so many different camps that they had trouble believing it was really him. Alistair Cram's story is not about one single spectacular escape. It's about a relentless personal war against captivity. He viewed it as his absolute duty to keep trying, no matter the consequences. His actions tied up countless hours of enemy manpower. His story is a testament to individual determination. It is compiled from official records and his own quiet accounts after the war, a less known but equally incredible narrative. What was the full psychological toll of so many failed attempts and recaptures? Did he have a standard escape kit that he prepared in each new camp he was sent to? And how did he manage to maintain his physical and mental health during his long periods on the run? Number 8, how do you disappear from a moving truck? The aftermath of a battle is chaotic. This chaos provided a unique opportunity for escape. Such was the case for French General Henri Giraud. Giraud was a high-ranking army commander captured by German forces during the Battle of France in 1940. Because of his rank, he was imprisoned in the Königstein Fortress, a high-security prison for VIPs similar to Colditz. Giraud was 63 years old, but he was determined to escape. For 2 years, he meticulously planned. He was allowed to receive packages from home. His wife smuggled in tools and other supplies hidden inside tins of food. He learned German from his guards and studied maps of the area. His most important tool was a 150-foot rope, which he painstakingly braided himself from pieces of twine, string, and even wire stripped from telephone lines. On April 17th, 1942, he put his plan into action. He managed to slip out of his cell and made his way to a high terrace of the fortress. Under the cover of darkness, he lowered his homemade rope and began the perilous descent down the cliff face. He was a large man, and the rope was thin. It was an incredible feat of physical strength and courage. Once at the bottom, he shaved his mustache and changed into civilian clothes. He was now on the run in the middle of Germany. He traveled by train using a carefully crafted cover story and his fluent German to avoid suspicion. He made his way to the Swiss border with the help of the French resistance. He crossed into Switzerland and then into Vichy, France. His escape was a sensation. It was a huge propaganda victory for the Allies and a major embarrassment for his captors. The story is a well-documented part of the history of the French resistance. How did his wife manage to get so many materials past the prison censors? What was the exact composition of his rope? And how did he test its strength before trusting his life to it? And were any of the guards at Königstein secretly sympathetic and willing to look the other way at a critical moment? Number 7. Can a group of men vanish into thin air? This story is not about a POW camp, but a civilian internment camp. In 1942, on the island of Singapore, the Japanese forces were victorious, and thousands of Allied civilians were rounded up and sent to the Changi internment camp. Among them was a man named Rob Scott. Scott and a group of other men realized that their best chance of escape was to do it quickly before the camp's security became too organized. They also knew that a sea journey was their only real hope. They began to secretly build a boat, but this was not possible. So they devised another plan. They located a large concrete culvert that ran under a road near the camp. They believed it might lead to a river that flowed to the sea. One night, a group of 17 men, led by Scott, decided to make their move. They slipped out of their barracks during a heavy rainstorm, which helped cover their noise and movement. They found the culvert and entered the dark, narrow pipe. They crawled on their hands and knees through mud and water for what felt like miles. After a terrifying journey, they emerged on the bank of a river. They had made it out of the camp, but their ordeal was far from over. They had to find a boat. They eventually managed to acquire a junk, type of Chinese sailing vessel. The group, with little to no sailing knowledge, set out for Sumatra. They faced storms, food and water shortages, and the constant threat of Japanese patrols. After a harrowing 51-day, 1,700-mile journey, what was left of the group finally reached safety in Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka. Their escape is one of the longest and most perilous sea voyages ever undertaken by escapees. Scott later documented the experience in his book, A Flyer's World. How did they navigate with no charts or instruments on their long sea journey? What was the full story of how they acquired the junk? And how many of the original 17 men survived the entire ordeal? Number 6, what if you had a key forged in hell? This is a story of immense courage from a place of unimaginable hardship. It concerns Charles Coward again, the British sergeant major from the Thorn Camp. After his activities there, he was sent to a labor camp that was part of a much larger and more notorious camp system near the town of Auschwitz in Poland. While in prison there, Coward used his position as a man in charge of a work party to commit incredible acts of sabotage and rescue. He was not just focused on his own escape. He was determined to help others. He witnessed the horrific treatment of other prisoners, particularly Jewish prisoners, and decided he had to act. He established a smuggling ring. He would trade food and supplies with local Polish workers. He used these connections to smuggle out information and, more importantly, to smuggle people out. He provided them with the papers and identities of deceased non-Jewish workers. One of his most audacious acts involved a key. He learned that many of the prisoners being sent to their deaths had valuables like gold fillings which were extracted. Through his network, he managed to get hold of some of this gold. He used it to bribe guards. Gold could buy food, medicine, and most importantly, a blind eye. This key allowed him to move around more freely and to orchestrate the escapes of hundreds of people. His own escape came near the end of the war. During a forced march, he managed to slip away. He was later recognized for his heroism, but his story is a complex one, filled with moral ambiguity and immense risk. He operated in a gray world where survival depended on cunning and bribery. His story is told in the book The Stolen Valuables and is a key part of the history of resistance within the camp system. What was the full extent of his network and how many guards were complicit in his activities? How did he manage to avoid betrayal for so long in such a dangerous environment? And how many people did he and his network actually manage to save? The numbers are still debated by historians. Number 5, how do you walk home through an entire continent? For prisoners held in Italy, the political situation was their greatest hope. In September 1943, the Italian government surrendered to the Allies. For a brief, chaotic period, the command structure in the POW camps collapsed. Some camp commandants simply opened the gates and let the prisoners go. Tens of thousands of Allied prisoners suddenly found themselves free, but in a country now occupied by their German adversaries. What followed was not a single escape, but thousands of individual journeys. It was a mass home run on an unprecedented scale. One of these men was a British sapper named Airey Neave. Neave had been captured on a commando raid. He escaped his prison camp during the confusion of the Italian armistice. He didn't have a plan or a support network. He just started walking south, hoping to reach the Allied lines. He was taken in by a local Italian family who hid him and nursed him back to health. He fell in love with the daughter of the family, Wanda. For months, he lived in hiding in the mountains, aided by a network of farmers and partisans who risked their own lives to help him. And his journey was one of constant fear and uncertainty. He had to avoid German patrols and Italian fascist informants. He eventually had to leave his newfound love and continue his journey south. After months on the run, he finally crossed into Allied-held territory. His story is a powerful account of the human cost of war and the kindness of strangers. He returned to Italy after the war to marry Wanda. He told his story in the classic travel memoir, Love and War in the Apennines. What is the true number of Allied prisoners who were successfully hidden by the Italian civilian population? How many of those civilians were executed for providing aid? And how many informal escape lines, like the one that helped Neave, operated independently of any official organization? Number 4, could you convince your captors? You were someone else entirely. This escape relied on a deep understanding of psychology and bureaucracy. Lieutenant Peter Tunstall was a Royal Air Force pilot held at Auflag Doppelek 1B in Szubin, Poland. He was a notorious troublemaker and a constant escape risk. He had been placed in solitary confinement so many times that the guards were well acquainted with him. He realized that his notoriety could be used against the system. He developed a plan with another officer, Flight Lieutenant Dominic Bruce, who was a small man. The plan was for Bruce to hide inside a large packing crate. The crate would be addressed to a fake address in neutral Sweden. The problem was getting the crate out of the camp. Tunstall's role was to create a massive diversion. He began a campaign of deliberate, calculated insubordination. He would insult the guards, disobey orders, and generally make a nuisance of himself. His goal was to be court-martialed. He knew that a court-martial would require him to be transported out of the camp to a different location. The plan worked. The camp commandant, fed up with Tunstall, arranged for his court-martial. On the day he was to be transported, the escape committee put their plan into action. While the guards were preoccupied with moving the problem prisoner, Tunstall, other prisoners loaded the packing crate containing Dominic Bruce onto the back of a supply truck leaving the camp. The diversion was a success. The crate was mailed, and Bruce spent several days inside, traveling across Germany. Unfortunately, he was discovered during a customs inspection at a port. But the plan itself was brilliant. It used the camp's own disciplinary procedures as the perfect cover for an escape. Tunstall's antics are documented in the annals of POW history, showing a different kind of warfare. What specific regulations did Tunstall study to know exactly how far he could push the guards before facing consequences that were too severe? How did Dominic Bruce survive for days inside a sealed crate with limited air and no sanitation? And did the camp authorities ever connect Tunstall's behavior to the escape attempt? Number 3, What does it take to move 100 tons of sand? This is the most famous prison escape of the war. It took place at Stalag Luft III, a camp for Allied airmen in Siegen, Germany. The camp was built on sandy soil, making tunnels difficult, and it was designed to be escape-proof. The man who orchestrated the plan was Squadron Leader Roger Bushell, a captured Spitfire pilot known as Big X. Bushell's idea was not just to escape a few men. His goal was to get 200 men out in a single night. The purpose was to create maximum disruption for the German war machine, forcing them to pull thousands of men from the front lines to hunt for the escapees. It was an act of organized warfare. The plan involved digging 3 separate tunnels, codenamed Tum Dick and Harry. The logic was that if one was discovered, the others could continue. The tunnels were 30 feet deep to avoid detection by sound monitors. The work was an incredible feat of engineering. The prisoners built their own air pump system using milk tins and hockey sticks. They created a wooden railway to haul out the sand. They even tapped into the camp's electrical grid to light the tunnels. The biggest problem was the sand. They excavated over 100 tons of it. It was a bright yellow color, completely different from the gray surface soil. They had to dispose of it without the guards noticing. Men called penguins carried the sand in long socks hidden inside their trousers, waddling to the gardens and subtly releasing it. On the night of March 24th, 1944, the escape began through Tunnel Harry. They discovered the tunnel exit was just short of the forest, in open view of a guard tower. This caused a major delay. In the end, 76 men got out before the escape was discovered. Of those 76, only 3 made it all the way to freedom. The consequences for those recaptured were severe. The story was famously told in the book The Great Escape by Paul Brickhill, one of the prisoners who had worked on the tunnels. How did the camp authorities, who were highly suspicious and conducted regular searches, fail to notice the disposal of 100 tons of sand? Were there any unknown collaborators inside the camp who fed the escape committee crucial information about the guards' routines? And why was the tunnel exit so badly miscalculated when every other aspect of the plan was so precise? Number 2, how do you betray your friends to save them? The story of the Shetland bus is not a single escape, but a network. It was a clandestine operation run by the British Special Operations Executive SOE and Norwegian sailors. They used small, unassuming fishing boats to ferry agents, supplies, and refugees between the Shetland Islands and occupied Norway. For downed airmen or escaped prisoners who made it to the Norwegian coast, the Shetland bus was their lifeline. One of the men who relied on this network was Leif Larsen, a Norwegian who became one of the most decorated naval officers of the war. He was not an escapee himself, but a rescuer. He captained one of the fishing boats and made over 50 trips across the treacherous North Sea. The journeys were incredibly dangerous. They had to avoid German patrols, navigate stormy seas in winter, and operate in total secrecy. The boats were often disguised as regular fishing vessels with weapons hidden below deck. A typical story would involve a group of Norwegian resistance fighters or escaped prisoners making their way to a prearranged rendezvous point on the coast. They would wait for a signal, then board Larsen's boat in the dead of night. The journey back to Shetland was perilous. Larsen and his crew had numerous close calls with enemy aircraft and patrol boats. The Shetland bus operation was vital. It maintained a link between Britain and the Norwegian resistance. It brought intelligence back to London and inserted trained agents into Norway. It was a lifeline of freedom, a constant thorn in the side of the occupying forces. The full history is captured in books like The Shetland Bus by David Howarth. How many people were successfully ferried to safety by the Shetland bus over the course of the war? What were the secret codes and signals used to coordinate pickups on the Norwegian coast? And how many boats and crew members were lost during the operation, their stories never fully told. Number 1, what if the only way out was to go back in? This is one of the most unusual escape stories. It belongs to Bram van der Stoke, a Dutch pilot flying with the Royal Air Force. He was one of the 3 men who made a successful home run from the Great Escape at Stalag Luft III. His journey after he got out of the tunnel is is a story in itself. After crawling out of Harry van der Stok, dressed as a Dutch worker, made his way to the train station. He spoke fluent German, French, and English, which was a huge advantage. He traveled by train across Germany, posing as a laborer. He bluffed his way through numerous document checks. At one point, he even shared a train compartment with a group of German generals. He made his way to Utrecht in his home country of the Netherlands, but he was not safe there. He was a wanted man, and the country was under occupation. He had to go into hiding. He made contact with the Dutch resistance. For weeks, he moved from safe house to safe house. His goal was to get to Spain. The resistance network guided him through Belgium and into France. In Paris, he linked up with another escape line. He was guided south towards the Pyrenees Mountains, which formed the border with neutral Spain. The final leg of his journey was a grueling trek over the mountains, led by local guides. He finally reached Spain, where he was briefly interned before being handed over to the British consulate. He was flown to England and returned to active duty as a pilot. He was one of only 3 men out of the 76 who escaped to make it all the way back. His incredible journey is detailed in his autobiography, War Pilot of Orange. He didn't just escape a camp, he escaped a continent. What were the specific names and locations of the safe houses he used in the Netherlands and France? How did the escape lines manage to verify his identity and trust that he was not an enemy agent? And during his train journeys, what were the closest calls he had where his cover was almost blown?